You know what? We need to start this story where all the best stories begin, at the very beginning. But not just any beginning. We're talking about the moment when human beings first looked up at mountains and thought, yeah, I'm going to live up there. Now think about this for a second. 7,000 years before Christ, we're talking about a time when most of human civilization was huddled in river valleys, growing crops, building the first cities. But some people looked at those impossibly high peaks scraping the sky and said, that's home. And here's the thing that gets me about these early mountain peoples. They didn't just survive up there. They created beauty. Real, intentional, sophisticated beauty. In places where every calorie mattered, where every breath was work, where the wind could literally strip the skin from your face, they still found time to make themselves beautiful. Let me paint you a picture. You're a woman living 7,000 years ago in the high valleys of the Hindu Kush. The air is so thin that lowland visitors would collapse just walking to your front door. Your hands are scarred from working with stone. Your face is weathered by winds that never stop. And every morning you wake up and you paint your face, not with makeup from some market stall. No, you're using ochre, that you ground yourself from rocks that your grandmother told you were sacred. You're mixing silver dust that came from stream beds where the old stories say the mountain spirits come to drink. Every line you paint on your face tells a story. Every color connects you to a peak, to a spirit, to a tradition that goes back so far that nobody remembers when it started. This wasn't vanity. This was survival made sacred. See, here's what we have to understand about mountain beauty in the ancient world. It wasn't separate from survival. It was survival. When a Quechua woman in the Andes braided her hair in patterns that took 3 hours to complete, she wasn't just styling her hair. She was creating a map. Each braid told you which peak watched over her birth, which spirits guided her family's footsteps through the thin air where every wrong turn could kill you. And get this, they discovered that coca leaves stained their lips the exact color of sunrise hitting snow. Think about that moment. Some woman, thousands of years ago, chewing coca to help her breathe in the thin air, and she notices her lips turning this incredible color. And instead of just accepting it as a side effect, she turned it into art. She made it beautiful. The Andes weren't the only place where this was happening. Over in the Celtic highlands of Britain and Ireland, women warriors were painting spirals on their faces with woad, in this blue dye that they made from plants that grew wild in the mountains. But these weren't random decorations. The spirals flowed like mountain mist. They moved like the fog that could hide you from your enemies or lead you off a cliff to your death. These Celtic mountain women wore torques, twisted gold necklaces that were so precisely crafted that the smiths claimed they could hear mountain spirits whispering to them while they worked. And you know what? Maybe they could. When you're working metal at elevations where the air is thin enough to make you hallucinate, when you're hammering gold by firelight in caves carved into living rock, who's to say what's real and what isn't? But here's what really gets me excited about this early period. These weren't isolated incidents. This was happening everywhere. Everywhere humans climbed high enough that the air got thin and the weather got mean, they developed these sophisticated beauty traditions that were absolutely unique to mountain life. In Tibet, the roof of the world, User, women were incorporating elements that could only exist at extreme altitude. They were using minerals that formed only in the thin air and intense solar radiation of the high plateau. Their beauty practices were literally shaped by the physics of living closer to space than to sea level. And these traditions weren't simple. We're talking about hair braiding patterns that encoded information about family lineage, spiritual beliefs, and geographic knowledge. A trained eye could look at how a woman wore her hair and tell you which valley she came from, which clan she belonged to, what spirits protected her family, and probably whether her husband was still alive. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These mountain beauty traditions developed independently, all over the world, but they shared certain characteristics that tell us something profound about human nature. First, they all emphasized durability. This wasn't beauty that lasted for one evening at court. This was beauty that had to survive blizzards, avalanches, and months of isolation. Mountain women created hairstyles that stayed beautiful for weeks. They developed cosmetics that wouldn't wash off in snow or fade in the intense ultraviolet radiation of high altitude. Second, they all incorporated elements that were literally impossible to obtain anywhere else. You couldn't fake mountain beauty in the lowlands because the materials simply didn't exist down there. The specific minerals, the high-altitude plants, the metals that could only be mined from certain peaks, mountain beauty was authentic in a way that lowland beauty could never replicate. And third, and this is crucial, mountain beauty was never just about appearance. It was always functional. Those face paints protected skin from wind and sun. Those elaborate hairstyles kept hair manageable in extreme weather. Those heavy silver ornaments, they were portable wealth that could be traded for food during harsh winters. But let's zoom in on one specific example that really shows you how sophisticated these early mountain beauty traditions were. In the high valleys of what we now call Afghanistan, women developed a technique for creating cosmetics from ground lapis lazuli, that incredibly blue stone that was so valuable it eventually became worth more than gold. These women weren't just crushing up pretty rocks. They were creating a pigment that had specific chemical properties. Lapis lazuli contains sulfur compounds that actually help protect skin from the intense ultraviolet radiation you get at high altitude. So when these women painted blue designs around their eyes, they weren't just making themselves beautiful, they were creating the world's first high-altitude sunscreen. And here's what blows my mind about this. We're talking about chemistry. These mountain women, 7,000 years before modern science, had figured out through trial and error that certain minerals could protect their skin. They turned survival into art. But it gets even better. The patterns they painted weren't random either. They developed geometric designs that seemed to help with snow blindness, the way the blue lines broke up harsh reflections off snow and ice. Beauty wasn't just functional, it was technological. Now imagine you're a lowland trader who makes the dangerous journey up to one of these mountain communities. You've climbed for days through passes that nearly killed you. The air is so thin you can barely think straight. Your lungs feel like they're on fire. And then you see these women, and they look like nothing you've ever imagined. Their skin is painted with colors that don't exist in your world. Their hair is arranged in patterns that seem to map the very mountains around you. Their jewelry catches light in ways that make you think of stars and ice and distant peaks. They move through this brutal landscape like it's their personal garden, and they do it while looking absolutely magnificent. This is where beauty becomes power. These mountain women weren't just surviving in impossible conditions. They were thriving. They were creating aesthetic traditions that made lowland beauty look pale and weak by comparison. When you can make yourself beautiful while living at the edge of the world, while breathing air that would kill most people, while enduring cold that would freeze a lowlander solid, that's not just beauty, that's superiority. And the mountains themselves became part of their beauty standard. In the European Alps, women learned to read the color of snow to predict weather, and they developed hairstyles that mimicked the patterns snow made when it blew across peaks. Their beauty became a form of environmental literacy. The Tibetan Plateau created its own unique aesthetic challenges. At altitudes where water boils at room temperature and the sun can blind you permanently, women developed beauty practices that dealt with extreme conditions no lowland culture ever had to consider. They created lip treatments from yak butter that wouldn't freeze solid in sub-zero temperatures. They developed eye makeup that protected against snow blindness while still looking beautiful. They figured out how to keep elaborate hairstyles intact in winds that could knock a horse off its feet. In the Andes, Where the air is so thin that thinking clearly becomes a survival skill, Quechua women created beauty rituals that were also mental exercises. The complex braiding patterns required such concentration and precision that they functioned as a form of meditation. Making yourself beautiful became a way of staying mentally sharp in an environment that could literally make you too stupid to live. And here's something that really gets me thinking about the big picture. These mountain beauty traditions lasted for thousands of years. Thousands. While empires rose and fell in the valleys below, while civilizations invented writing and mathematics and philosophy, these mountain women were perfecting aesthetic traditions that connected them directly to their environment in ways that lowland cultures never achieved. They weren't trying to fight their environment or overcome it. They were making themselves beautiful with it. Their beauty standards were shaped by avalanche seasons and monsoon patterns, and the migration routes of high-altitude animals. They made themselves part of the landscape in the most literal sense possible. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. These weren't primitive people making do with what they had. These were sophisticated cultures that developed their own technologies, their own aesthetics, their own ways of understanding beauty, that were completely independent of what was happening in the rest of the world. When we talk about the cradles of civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, we're talking about places where people settled down and built cities. But up in the mountains, people were doing something different. They were creating civilizations that moved with the seasons, that adapted to conditions that would destroy settled communities, that made beauty out of survival itself. And as we're about to see, when these mountain cultures finally did come into contact with the great civilizations of the lowlands, well, that's when things got really interesting. Because it turns out that when you've spent thousands of years making yourself beautiful while living at the edge of the possible, you tend to make quite an impression on people who've never had to test their aesthetic traditions against anything more challenging than a change in fashion. The mountain women were about to meet the world, and the world was about to discover what beauty looked like when it was forged in ice and stone and thin air, and the kind of conditions that separate the strong from the dead. So the mountain women had established their beauty traditions in isolation, creating aesthetic practices that were literally impossible to replicate anywhere else on Earth. But isolation doesn't last forever, and when it ended, too bad. When these mountain cultures finally made contact with the great civilizations of the lowlands, that's when the real story begins. Picture this. It's 600 after Christ. Rome has fallen. Europe is fragmenting into dozens of warring kingdoms, and on the Isle of Skye, off the coast of Scotland, a woman named Scathach is running what might be the most exclusive military academy in the world. But here's the thing about Scathach. She wasn't just teaching warfare. She was teaching that beauty and combat were the same thing. Her students learned to paint their shields with the exact same spiral patterns they wore on their faces. When they braided their hair, they were creating weapons, styles that wouldn't come undone in battle, that could hide small blades, that intimidated enemies who had never seen anything like mountain war paint flowing into elaborate Celtic knots. And these weren't just local farm girls learning to defend their villages. Warriors came from across Europe to train with Scathach. They climbed to her mountain academy because they'd heard rumors of women who could fight like demons and look like goddesses while doing it. Now think about what this means. In an age when most of Europe was still figuring out how to rebuild after Rome's collapse, mountain women were setting the standard for what a warrior should look like. Their beauty wasn't decoration added to fighting ability. It was fighting ability. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who looked absolutely magnificent while trying to kill you. That's a weapon more powerful than any sword. But Scathach's academy was just one example of something happening all across the mountain world. In Tibet, something even more remarkable was taking place. Princess Wencheng arrives in 641 after Christ to marry the Tibetan king. She's coming from the Tang dynasty court in China, one of the most sophisticated civilizations on earth. She brings silk that costs more than most people make in a lifetime. She brings cosmetics created by imperial craftsmen who've spent generations perfecting their art. She brings beauty standards from a culture that had been refining aesthetic practice for thousands of years. And you know what happens? The mountain women take one look at these incredible Chinese luxuries, and they make them better. They take Chinese silk, this delicate, precious fabric that represents the height of lowland craftsmanship, and they weave yak wool into it. Suddenly, you have a fabric that has all the beauty of silk but can survive a Tibetan winter. They take Chinese rouge, IT fouls, these carefully formulated cosmetics, and they grind them together with minerals from the Tibetan plateau. Now you have colors that had never existed before. Pinks that matched alpine flowers blooming at 17,000 feet. Reds that echoed sunset on snow at altitudes where the air is so thin that sunset looks different than anywhere else on Earth. This wasn't cultural borrowing, this was cultural conquest. The mountain women took the best that Chinese civilization had to offer, and they made it into something the Chinese had never imagined. And here's where it gets really interesting. Princess Wencheng doesn't just adopt these hybrid beauty practices, she becomes their champion. When she sends reports back to the Chinese court, she's not describing Tibetan beauty as primitive or backward. She's describing techniques and materials that don't exist in China. She's telling the Tang dynasty about beauty innovations that could only happen at the roof of the world. Meanwhile, over in the Swiss Alps, the Alemanni tribes were creating their own version of mountain royalty. These weren't kings and queens in the lowland sense, people who inherited power through bloodlines and lived in castles. These were leaders who earned their position by mastering the specific skills that mountain life demanded. And the women. The women wore their authority in silver circlets that caught starlight. But those circlets weren't just pretty jewelry. They were information systems. Each one was crafted to tell the story of the woman wearing it. The patterns etched into the silver mapped her family's territorial claims. The way it was worn indicated her role in the community's decision-making process. The specific alloy used told you which peaks her family controlled mining rights to. And the hair braiding. This is where mountain beauty became political strategy. Left side for maternal lineage, right side for paternal. Silver threads for warriors who died in battle, gold threads for those who lived to see grandchildren. But here's the sophisticated part. The patterns also indicated alliances. When Alemanni women met for tribal councils, they could read each other's political positions just by looking at their hair. Imagine trying to conduct diplomacy when every participant is wearing their family history, their territorial claims, and their current political alliances as fashion statements. This wasn't just beauty. This was a visual language more complex than most written languages of the time. But the most fascinating example of mountain beauty, as political power, comes from the Carpathian Mountains. These peaks, stretching across what we now call Romania and Hungary, produced women whose appearance was so distinctive that it literally created legends. See, the Carpathian women rarely saw full sunlight. The mountains created perpetual twilight in the deep valleys where they lived. Their skin stayed pale as moonlight. Their hair grew long and dark as mountain shadows. And when they finally did emerge from their hidden valleys, well, lowland people thought they were seeing supernatural beings. This is where vampire legends really come from. Not from some fictional monster, but from the shock of lowland people encountering mountain women whose beauty had been shaped by conditions that didn't exist anywhere else. These women wore amber from the Baltic forests, pieces containing insects so perfectly preserved that they looked like trapped souls. They moved through landscapes that would kill most lowlanders. They appeared and disappeared into mountain mists like spirits. But here's what the legends miss. These weren't supernatural beings. They were humans who had adapted their beauty standards to an environment so extreme that it produced an aesthetic that lowland cultures couldn't even comprehend, and they used this to their advantage. Carpathian mountain women became the most sought-after diplomats and negotiators in Eastern Europe. When you needed to conduct sensitive negotiations, when you needed someone who could move unseen through hostile territory, when you needed to make an impression that would last for generations, you hired a Carpathian woman. Their beauty was their credentials. One look told you that this person had survived conditions that would destroy most humans, that they possessed knowledge about mountain travel, about reading weather patterns, about finding resources in landscapes that appeared barren, that they could navigate by stars visible only at high altitude, that they understood the kind of survival skills that could keep armies alive or get them killed. Now, here's what really gets me excited about this period. These weren't isolated examples. This was happening everywhere mountains met civilization. Mountain women were stepping onto the world stage not as curiosities or exotic dancers, but as power brokers whose beauty was inseparable from their capabilities. In the Pyrenees, mountain women developed beauty practices that blended Celtic traditions with Mediterranean influences. They wore distinctive red caps that marked them as mountain people, but the caps weren't just identification, they were engineering. The specific way they were constructed helped with high-altitude breathing. The red color was created from plants that only grew above the tree line. The patterns woven into them indicated which passes the wearer could guide you through safely. These women became the essential link between the Mediterranean world and Northern Europe. If you wanted to move goods, information, or armies across the Pyrenees, you needed mountain women who could navigate the passes, and their beauty standards became a form of professional certification. The more elaborate your traditional mountain dress, the more peaks you'd mastered, the more complex your hair braiding, the more routes you could navigate safely. But perhaps the most sophisticated example of mountain beauty as political power comes from the Andes during this period. The various mountain cultures that would eventually become the Inca Empire were developing beauty standards that incorporated mathematical principles more advanced than most European universities were teaching. Andean women arranged their hair in patterns based on geometric principles. Each braid followed mathematical ratios that engineers were using to build temples and fortresses. Their textile patterns incorporated the same geometric relationships that governed their architecture. When you looked at an Andean mountain woman in full traditional dress, you were looking at a walking demonstration of mathematical knowledge. And this wasn't accidental. In the thin air of the high Andes, where thinking clearly was literally a survival skill, beauty practices that required mathematical precision served as mental exercises. The women who could create the most complex patterns were demonstrating that they could think clearly at altitudes where most people's cognitive abilities deteriorated. This made them invaluable as administrators, engineers, and military strategists. The Andean cultures developed political systems where positions of authority were often filled by women whose beauty standards proved their intellectual capabilities. Now, here's where this gets really interesting from a historical perspective. While Europe was struggling through what we call the Dark Ages, centuries of political fragmentation and technological stagnation, mountain cultures were experiencing a golden age of aesthetic innovation. They had figured out something that lowland civilizations kept missing. Beauty wasn't separate from capability. It wasn't decoration added to function. It was function. The most beautiful mountain women were also the most capable, the most intelligent, the most politically sophisticated. Their aesthetic traditions were selection mechanisms for leadership, and when lowland cultures finally encountered these mountain societies, the impact was profound. Suddenly, lowland beauty standards that emphasized delicacy and helplessness looked, well, they looked weak. How could you admire pale skin that indicated someone couldn't survive outdoors when you'd seen mountain women whose bronzed faces showed they could navigate landscapes that would kill you? How could you find appeal in elaborate hairstyles that fell apart in the first breeze when you'd witnessed mountain women whose braids stayed perfect through blizzards? This created the first great crisis in lowland beauty standards. For the first time, civilizations that had considered themselves the height of sophistication were confronted with aesthetic traditions that were demonstrably superior in practical terms. Some lowland cultures tried to adopt mountain beauty practices. But here's the problem. You couldn't fake it. Mountain beauty required mountain materials, mountain skills, mountain knowledge. When lowland women tried to copy mountain hairstyles, they fell apart. When they tried to use mountain cosmetics, they couldn't source the right materials. When they tried to wear mountain jewelry, they didn't understand the symbolic language embedded in every piece. But some lowland people did start making the journey to mountain communities to learn, and this created the first beauty schools, FY, places where mountain women taught their techniques to outsiders who were willing to endure the hardships necessary to master them. These schools became centers of cultural exchange. Mountain women shared their aesthetic knowledge in return for lowland innovations in metallurgy, textile production, and artistic techniques. But the mountain women maintained control. You learned mountain beauty on their terms, in their environment, according to their standards. And that's how mountain beauty standards began to influence the wider world. Not through conquest or cultural domination, but through demonstrated superiority. When you could prove that your beauty traditions produced women who were stronger, smarter, more capable, and more durable than anything lowland cultures could create. Well, that's influence that lasts. But this was just the beginning. As we're about to see, the medieval period would bring even greater innovations in mountain beauty culture. The isolation that had preserved these traditions was about to become the foundation for aesthetic achievements that would make everything we've discussed so far look like preparation for the main event. The mountain women were about to enter their golden age. The medieval period brought something unprecedented to mountain cultures worldwide. For the first time in human history, being isolated wasn't a disadvantage. It was the ultimate luxury. While lowland civilizations battled over trade routes and fertile valleys, mountain communities found themselves sitting on resources that the rest of the world desperately wanted, but couldn't access without mountain knowledge. And mountain women? They became the gatekeepers of the impossible. Let me set the scene for you. It's the 11th century. The Scottish Highlands are experiencing what we might call the first fashion revolution in human history. Clan tartans are evolving from simple woven patterns into something that would make modern fashion designers weep with envy. But here's what makes this remarkable. Each pattern was a language. When a MacLeod woman from Skye wrapped herself in her clan tartan, she wasn't just getting dressed. She was putting on a textile that told the entire history of her people. The specific combination of colours indicated which branches of the clan had intermarried, which battles they'd won or lost, which alliances they'd formed with neighbouring clans. The way the plaid was folded and pinned required hours to perfect. This wasn't clothing you threw on. This was a daily ritual that demanded the same precision and dedication that samurai brought to maintaining their swords. And just like samurai armour, every fold had meaning. The way the fabric fell across the shoulder indicated the woman's role in clan hierarchy. The specific angle of the pin showed whether she was married, widowed, or available for courtship. But here's where it gets absolutely fascinating. The MacLeod women of Skye developed something they called the fairy flag pattern. Now, the official story was that this pattern came from supernatural lovers who visited mountain women in the mists. But when you look at the actual weaving technique, this was technology. The pattern created an optical illusion that made the wearer difficult to track visually in Highland mist and fog. The specific colour combinations blended with the landscape in ways that provided natural camouflage. The weaving technique incorporated metallic threads that reflected light at specific angles, creating a shimmer that could be used for long-distance signalling between peaks. These women had developed wearable stealth technology 600 years before military strategists started thinking about camouflage as a science. Meanwhile, over in the Swiss cantons, alpine women were creating what they called mountain snow, lace so fine and intricate that it seemed impossible for human hands to create. But this wasn't just decorative art. This was mathematics made visible. The women of St. Gallen developed lace patterns based on their observations of ice crystal formation. They would spend winter mornings studying how frost formed on their windows, how snow accumulated in specific patterns, how ice created geometric designs that were never quite the same but always followed certain mathematical principles. Then they went home and recreated those patterns in thread. Think about the level of skill this required. You're working by candlelight through winter months when daylight lasts maybe 6 hours. Your hands are numb from cold. The thread is so fine that one wrong move ruins hours of work. And you're creating patterns so complex that they encode the geometric principles that govern how water freezes at high altitude. These lace workshops became temples of aesthetic devotion. Young girls began their training at age 5, learning to see mathematical relationships in natural phenomena, developing the manual dexterity to translate those observations into thread, building the mental discipline to maintain perfect concentration for hours at a time. But the lace wasn't just beautiful, it was functional in ways that seem almost magical. The specific weaving techniques created fabrics that regulated temperature naturally. The geometric patterns channeled airflow in ways that provided cooling in summer and insulation in winter. The mathematical relationships built into the designs created textiles that were stronger and more durable than anything produced by simple weaving. European nobility started paying incredible sums for St. Gallen lace, not just because it was beautiful, but because it was technologically superior to anything their own craftsmen could produce. Mountain women had figured out how to make cloth that was simultaneously decorative art, engineering achievement, and mathematical proof. But the most sophisticated example of medieval mountain beauty culture was happening on the Tibetan plateau, where Buddhism was creating entirely new ways of thinking about aesthetic practice. When the Gelug school of Buddhism emerged in the 14th century, it could have meant the end of traditional Tibetan beauty practices. After all, Buddhism generally emphasized spiritual development over physical appearance, but mountain women found a way to transform their beauty traditions into spiritual practice. They kept wearing their elaborate silver jewelry, but now each piece incorporated Buddhist symbols. Prayer wheels were built into hair ornaments. Protective mantras were engraved on the backs of mirrors. Traditional cosmetics were blessed by lamas before use, transforming the daily ritual of applying makeup into a form of meditation. But here's the ingenious part. They used their traditional beauty practices to deepen their understanding of Buddhist philosophy. The intricate braiding patterns became exercises in mindfulness, requiring the kind of focused attention that Buddhism taught as fundamental spiritual practice. The process of applying mineral-based cosmetics became a meditation on impermanence, AZ, creating beauty that would fade, practicing non-attachment to physical appearance, while still honoring the body as a vehicle for spiritual development. Their hair ornaments incorporated coral from distant seas and turquoise that matched high-altitude skies. But these weren't just pretty decorations. Coral represented the connection between all life forms. Turquoise symbolized the clarity of mind that came from spiritual practice. When a Tibetan mountain woman arranged her hair, she was creating a mandala, a sacred geometric pattern that served as a focus for meditation. The most remarkable innovation was their integration of mathematical principles into beauty practices. Hair was arranged in patterns that followed the golden ratio, HIT, the same mathematical relationship that governed the construction of Buddhist temples. Jewelry was designed according to geometric principles that were believed to harmonize the Prachinfauns, wearer's energy with the natural rhythms of the universe. This wasn't superstition. This was sophisticated understanding of how visual patterns affect human psychology and physiology. These women had figured out that certain geometric relationships created feelings of harmony and well-being. They were using beauty as technology for optimizing human consciousness. But if you really want to see mountain beauty at its most sophisticated, you have to look at what was happening in the Andes during the height of the Inca Empire. 15th century Inca mountain women became living art in the most literal sense possible. Their textiles were woven with threads of actual silver and gold, not silver-colored thread, actual precious metal spun into fibers and woven into fabric. They were walking around wearing clothing that was simultaneously artistic masterpiece, display of wealth, and technological achievement. But the real innovation was in how they thought about beauty and mathematics. Inca beauty standards were based on geometric perfection that matched their architecture. When you looked at Machu Picchu or Sacsayhuaman, Inca, these incredible stone structures that seem impossible, even by modern engineering standards, you were seeing the same design principles that governed how Inca women arranged their hair. Each braid followed mathematical ratios that engineers used to build temples. The patterns weren't just beautiful, they were demonstrations of geometric knowledge. An Inca woman in full traditional dress was a walking proof of her culture's mathematical sophistication, and this had practical implications. In the thin air of the high Andes, where cognitive function deteriorated rapidly, the mental discipline required to create these complex patterns served as brain training. Women who could maintain the concentration necessary for elaborate mathematical hairstyles were proving their ability to think clearly at altitudes where most people's intellectual capabilities collapsed. This made them invaluable as administrators and engineers. The Inca developed a system where positions requiring mathematical precision were often filled by women whose beauty practices demonstrated their intellectual capabilities. Now here's what makes this period so remarkable from a historical perspective. While European universities were just beginning to rediscover ancient Greek mathematics, mountain women were developing and applying geometric principles that wouldn't be formally described by European mathematicians for centuries. They were using beauty as a form of applied mathematics. Their aesthetic traditions were more advanced than the academic knowledge of most European scholars, but the most fascinating development was happening in the Pyrenees, where mountain women were creating beauty practices that blended Celtic traditions with Mediterranean influences in ways that created entirely new aesthetic categories. Pyrenean women wore distinctive red caps that marked them as mountain people, but the caps weren't just identification, they were engineering solutions to high-altitude living. The specific construction helped with breathing in thin air. The red color came from plants that only grew above the tree line and had properties that protected against intense ultraviolet radiation. The patterns woven into them weren't just decorative, they were maps indicating which mountain passes the wearer could navigate safely. But the real innovation was in their dance traditions. Pyrenean mountain women developed traditional dances that required beauty standards, emphasizing both grace and endurance. These weren't performances, they were training programs. The dances taught mountain navigation skills, built the cardiovascular fitness necessary for high-altitude travel, and developed the balance and coordination required for traversing dangerous terrain. When you watched a Pyrenean woman dance, you were watching someone demonstrate the physical capabilities that made her qualified to guide travelers through mountain passes. Beauty and competence were literally the same thing. This created a feedback loop that drove continuous innovation. Mountain women competed not just to look beautiful, but to develop beauty practices that proved superior capabilities. Each generation pushed the boundaries of what was possible, creating aesthetic traditions that were simultaneously more beautiful and more functional than what came before. By the end of the medieval period, mountain beauty culture had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created aesthetic traditions that were simultaneously artistic masterpieces, technological innovations, mathematical proofs, and practical training programs. But this golden age was about to face its greatest challenge. The Renaissance was coming, and with it, the first serious threat to mountain beauty autonomy that these cultures had ever encountered. Trade routes were opening, printing presses were spreading new ideas, and for the first time in thousands of years, mountain communities were about to discover what happened when their isolated perfection met the broader world's determination to change everything. The storm clouds were gathering. The Renaissance hit mountain communities like an avalanche nobody saw coming. For thousands of years, these cultures had developed in splendid isolation, perfecting beauty traditions that were literally impossible to replicate anywhere else on Earth. But suddenly, the world was shrinking. Trade routes were opening through mountain passes. New technologies were making previously impossible journeys routine. And mountain women found themselves face to face with something they'd never encountered before. Lowland people who thought mountain beauty needed improvement. Picture this moment. It's 1500 after Christ. A Venetian merchant caravan finally makes it through an alpine pass that's been closed to outsiders for centuries. These traders are carrying mirrors, real glass mirrors, not the polished metal reflections that mountain people had been using. They're carrying silk from China, spices from India, cosmetics from Constantinople. They represent the height of Renaissance sophistication, and when they reach that first mountain village, they start setting up shop like they're bringing civilization to barbarians. The mountain women crowd around these foreign goods, and for the first time in their lives, they see their own faces clearly reflected in perfect glass. They touch silk that's softer than anything they've ever felt. They smell perfumes created by master craftsmen who've spent generations perfecting their art. And then they look at themselves, and for just a moment, they wonder if maybe the lowlanders are right. Maybe their wind-carved features and calloused hands and practical clothing really are primitive compared to the pale, soft beauty of Renaissance ideals. Now here's what makes this moment so critical. This wasn't just about fashion. This was about the fundamental question of whether mountain beauty standards could survive contact with the wider world. For the first time, mountain women had to choose between their ancestral traditions and what appeared to be superior alternatives. Some villages split apart over this question. Families found themselves divided between those who embraced lowland beauty standards and those who insisted that mountain traditions were not just different, but better. Arguments broke out over whether traditional face paints honored ancestors or made women look like savages. Young women started hiding their clan tartans and wearing Italian silk instead. But the real crisis came with the Protestant Reformation. When Calvinist preachers reached the Swiss cantons, they didn't just challenge religious beliefs, they declared war on mountain beauty culture itself. These preachers looked at the elaborate silver, jewelry that mountain women had worn for centuries, and called it sinful vanity. They saw the intricate lace patterns that encoded mathematical knowledge and called them unnecessary luxury. They watched the careful ritual of applying mineral-based cosmetics and declared it pagan decoration that insulted God. Now think about what this meant for mountain communities. Their beauty traditions weren't just personal choices, they were the foundation of their entire cultural identity. When you attacked mountain beauty practices, you were attacking everything that made mountain culture distinct from lowland civilization. The women of Appenzell found themselves caught between their faith and their heritage. Some chose religion over tradition, putting away their silver ornaments and covering their elaborate hairstyles with plain caps. But others developed what they called hidden beauty practices, wearing plain clothes in public while maintaining their traditional costumes for private celebrations. This created an underground beauty culture. Mountain women would gather in secret to practice their traditional arts, teaching their daughters techniques that could only be displayed in hidden ceremonies. They developed ways to incorporate traditional elements into apparently plain clothing, secret pockets for small pieces of family jewelry, subtle patterns woven into seemingly simple fabric hairstyles that looked Calvinist approved from the front but maintained traditional braiding in back. But the most dramatic confrontation came in Scotland, where the Union of Crowns in 1603 brought English beauty standards directly into Highland courts. Flora MacDonald's grandmother, a Highland chieftain's daughter, became a legend when she appeared at Edinburgh Court in 1650, wearing full traditional Highland dress, complete with face paint and weapons. The English courtiers were scandalized. Here was this uncivilized mountain woman showing up at the seat of royal power, looking like she was ready for war, but she didn't apologize or change. Instead, she gave a speech that every Highland woman memorized. Mountain beauty is warrior beauty. We make ourselves beautiful for battle, not for comfort. If you cannot understand this, then you do not understand what it means to earn your beauty through strength. The English court didn't know what to do with her. They couldn't dismiss her as ignorant. She was clearly intelligent, articulate, and politically sophisticated. They couldn't call her weak or helpless. Please, she was obviously capable of violence that would make most courtiers flee in terror. And they couldn't deny that she was beautiful, but it was a kind of beauty that made their powder and silk look pale and artificial by comparison. This created a crisis in English beauty standards. For the first time, English nobility encountered a beauty tradition that was demonstrably superior in practical terms. Highland women weren't just attractive, they were competent in ways that English court ladies could never match. But the real test came during the 30 Years' War, when mountain beauty traditions faced their ultimate challenge, total war. As armies swept through alpine valleys, mountain women discovered that their traditional beauty practices became survival tools. Those secret compartments in traditional dress that had been used to hide family treasures during religious persecution. Now they hid documents and money during military occupation. Those hairstyles that could conceal small weapons? Suddenly, they were life-saving tactical advantages. Mountain women developed war beauty practices that emphasized concealment and deception. They learned to use cosmetics to alter their appearance quickly, to arrange their clothing to hide valuable items, to move through familiar terrain in ways that made them nearly invisible to foreign soldiers. Their beauty became resistance. When you could make yourself beautiful, while simultaneously preparing for guerrilla warfare, you were demonstrating a kind of competence that made occupying armies nervous. But perhaps the most fascinating cultural collision was happening in Tibet, where Jesuit missionaries were encountering mountain beauty traditions that challenged everything they thought they knew about civilization. These missionaries arrived expecting to find primitive people who would be grateful for European enlightenment. Instead, they found mountain women whose beauty practices were more sophisticated than anything they'd seen in European courts. The Tibetan women used mineral cosmetics that were chemically more advanced than European alternatives. Their jewelry incorporated mathematical principles that European scholars were just beginning to understand. Their clothing was engineered for conditions that would kill most Europeans. The missionaries found themselves in an impossible position. They were supposed to condemn traditional Tibetan beauty practices as pagan, but they couldn't deny that these practices were technologically superior to European alternatives. When Tibetan women demonstrated cosmetics that didn't fade in extreme weather, clothing that regulated body temperature automatically, and jewelry that served multiple practical functions, the missionaries had to admit that maybe European civilization didn't have all the answers. Some young Tibetan women began experimenting with European beauty styles, creating hybrid practices that scandalized both Buddhist monks and Christian missionaries. They would wear European-style clothing but incorporate traditional Tibetan jewelry. They would use European cosmetics but apply them in traditional Tibetan patterns. They were creating fusion beauty that took the best elements from both cultures while remaining distinctly Tibetan. But here's what really gets me about this period. Mountain women weren't just passive recipients of outside influence. They were actively choosing which elements of lowland culture to adopt and which to reject. And their choices were strategic. They adopted lowland technologies that enhanced their traditional practices. Glass mirrors made it easier to create precise traditional makeup applications. Steel needles made traditional embroidery more detailed. New dyes allowed traditional patterns to be rendered in colors that had never been possible before, but they rejected lowland beauty ideals that would make them less capable. They weren't interested in pale skin that indicated inability to work outdoors. They didn't want hairstyles that collapsed in mountain weather. They refused clothing that would restrict movement or fail in extreme conditions. This selective adoption created hybrid beauty traditions that were more sophisticated than anything that had come before. Mountain women were taking the best innovations from lowland cultures and integrating them into aesthetic practices that remained distinctly mountain in character. And this is where the story gets really interesting from a historical perspective, because while lowland cultures thought they were civilizing backward mountain peoples, what was actually happening was the opposite. Mountain cultures were demonstrating that their beauty traditions were more advanced, more practical, and more sustainable than lowland alternatives. The question was whether mountain communities could maintain this cultural confidence as contact with the outside world became more frequent and more intense. The Renaissance had brought the first serious challenge to mountain beauty autonomy, but that was just the beginning. The Industrial Revolution was coming, and with it, forces that would test mountain beauty traditions in ways that no one could have imagined. The isolation that had protected these cultures for thousands of years was about to end forever, and mountain women would have to decide whether their beauty traditions were strong enough to survive. In a world that was changing faster than anyone could control, the storm clouds were gathering into something that would either destroy mountain beauty culture forever, or transform it into something even more remarkable than it had been before. The Industrial Revolution didn't arrive gradually in mountain regions. It exploded through their world like dynamite through granite. In 1850, the first railway line punched through the Alps, and everything changed overnight. Suddenly, places that had taken weeks to reach could be visited in a matter of hours. And those visitors brought with them ideas about beauty that would challenge everything mountain women had believed about themselves for thousands of years. Picture the moment when the first steam train pulled into a Swiss alpine village. The mountain women who gathered to watch this mechanical marvel probably thought they were witnessing the future arriving in their valley. What they couldn't have known was that they were watching the end of their isolation and the beginning of the greatest crisis their beauty traditions had ever faced. Because those trains weren't just carrying passengers, they were carrying photographers, journalists, and tourists who looked at mountain women like they were exotic specimens in a natural history museum. And for the first time in history, mountain beauty was being documented, analyzed, and judged by people who had no understanding of what they were looking at. Photography reached the Scottish Highlands in the 1860s, and suddenly Highland women could see how their traditional beauty appeared to outside eyes. The Romantic movement had already begun fetishizing Highland culture through Walter Scott's novels, but photographs revealed the stark difference between literary romance and mountain reality. Here's what those early photographs show: Highland women whose beauty was absolutely functional. Their clothing was designed for weather that could kill you. Their hairstyles stayed intact through storms that would destroy any lowland fashion. Their faces bore the marks of lives lived in conditions that would break most people. But when lowland viewers looked at these photographs, they didn't see strength and competence. They saw women who looked rough compared to the pale, delicate beauty standards that Victorian society preferred. Highland women found themselves being pitied for living lives that they considered superior to anything the lowlands could offer. This created an identity crisis that split mountain communities apart. Some Highland women began trying to soften their appearance, adopting lowland beauty practices that made them look more civilized in photographs. Others doubled down on traditional Highland aesthetics, wearing their clan tartans and face paint with defiant pride. But the real transformation was happening in the American mountains, where the Civil War was creating entirely new categories of mountain beauty. As Appalachian men left to fight in distant battles, mountain women took over roles that had traditionally been male. They ran farms, managed businesses, and made decisions that affected entire communities, and their beauty standards adapted to emphasize capability over ornament. They developed shorter hairstyles that stayed out of the way during physical labor. They created practical clothing that honored traditional patterns while allowing freedom of movement. They embraced a fierce independence that became its own kind of beauty, the aesthetic of women who didn't need anyone's protection because they could protect themselves. This frontier beauty became something entirely new in human history, an aesthetic that emphasized competence as the highest form of attractiveness. When you could run a farm, raise children, and defend your property, all while looking absolutely magnificent, well, that was beauty that made delicate Victorian femininity look weak and useless by comparison. Meanwhile, in the Swiss Alps, the development of mountaineering as a sport in the 1860s created a completely new economy around mountain beauty. Wealthy lowland climbers started hiring mountain women as guides and porters, and suddenly traditional mountain skills had cash value in the global economy. These women found themselves in the remarkable position of being paid by lowlanders to teach them how to survive in mountain conditions. Their traditional knowledge about weather patterns, route finding, and high-altitude survival became valuable expertise that wealthy tourists would pay premium prices to access. But here's where it gets really interesting. Mountain women started adapting their beauty standards to emphasize the exact capabilities that made them valuable as guides. They developed hairstyles that demonstrated their ability to function in extreme weather. They wore clothing that showcased their knowledge of mountain-specific gear. They carried themselves in ways that communicated competence and reliability. This created a feedback loop where traditional mountain beauty became a form of professional certification. The more authentically mountain you appeared, the more qualified you seemed as a guide. Lowland tourists wanted guides who looked like they belonged in the mountains, not like they were trying to imitate lowland fashion. The California Gold Rush brought another fascinating development. Mountain women from across America converged on the Sierra Nevada, creating a melting pot of mountain beauty traditions that had never interacted before. You had Appalachian women with their practical frontier aesthetics meeting Celtic Highlanders with their clan traditions. Scandinavian mountain women with their intricate braiding techniques encountered Native American women with their own sophisticated hair arts. Spanish mountain women from the southwest brought beauty practices adapted to desert peaks. This convergence created fusion beauty traditions that took the best elements from multiple mountain cultures. Women learned new techniques from each other, adapted traditional practices to new environments, and created hybrid aesthetics that were more versatile and more resilient than anything that had existed before. But the most unexpected development was happening globally, as the opening of Japan in 1854 created connections between mountain cultures on opposite sides of the world. Japanese mountain women discovered that their traditional beauty practices shared surprising similarities with Tibetan and Andean cultures they'd never heard of. The use of mineral cosmetics, the emphasis on spiritual protection through appearance, the integration of natural materials into aesthetic practice, ESA, these weren't unique to any single mountain culture. They were universal responses to the specific challenges of high-altitude living. This realization was revolutionary. Mountain women began to understand that their beauty traditions weren't just local customs, they were sophisticated solutions to environmental challenges that produced similar innovations wherever humans lived above the tree line. And this knowledge gave them new confidence in dealing with lowland criticism. When lowlanders dismissed mountain beauty as primitive, mountain women could point to identical practices developing independently on multiple continents. These weren't backward customs. They were advanced technologies for thriving in conditions that most humans couldn't survive. But the Industrial Revolution also brought challenges that tested mountain beauty traditions in unprecedented ways. Mass production made lowland beauty products cheaper and more accessible than traditional mountain cosmetics. Railroads brought fashion magazines that showed mountain women what modern beauty was supposed to look like. Telegraph lines carried news that made mountain communities feel increasingly isolated from the wider world. Some mountain women began abandoning their traditional practices in favor of industrial beauty products. Why spend hours grinding minerals for cosmetics when you could buy manufactured makeup? Why maintain elaborate traditional hairstyles when simple styles were more fashionable? Why wear heavy traditional clothing when factory-made fabrics were lighter and cheaper? But other mountain women recognized that industrial beauty products weren't designed for mountain conditions. Mass-produced cosmetics faded in high-altitude sun. Factory clothing failed in extreme weather. Simple hairstyles collapsed in mountain winds. These women became the guardians of traditional knowledge, preserving techniques that had been refined over thousands of years. They formed informal networks that shared traditional recipes, taught traditional techniques, and maintained traditional standards even as the world around them changed rapidly. This created a split in mountain beauty culture that would define the next century. Some communities embraced modernization, adopting lowland beauty standards as markers of progress and sophistication. Others retreated into traditionalism, preserving mountain beauty practices as sacred heritage that must be protected at all costs. But the most interesting groups were those that found ways to synthesize traditional and modern approaches. These communities maintained the functional core of mountain beauty traditions while incorporating industrial innovations that enhanced rather than replaced traditional practices. They used industrial tools to create traditional patterns more precisely. They adopted new materials that made traditional clothing more durable. They learned new techniques that allowed traditional cosmetics to be produced more efficiently. This synthesis approach proved to be remarkably successful. Communities that managed to blend tradition and innovation created beauty cultures that were simultaneously more authentic and more practical than either pure traditionalism or complete modernization. As the 19th century ended, mountain beauty traditions had survived their first encounter with industrial civilization. They had been tested, challenged, and transformed, but they had not been destroyed. The question was whether they could survive what was coming next. The 20th century would bring total war, global communication, and social changes that would make the Industrial Revolution look gradual by comparison. Mountain women were about to face their ultimate test. The 20th century hit mountain regions like a series of avalanches, each one more devastating than the last. But if you expected mountain women to be buried under these crushing forces of modernization, you'd be wrong, because what happened instead was something nobody saw coming. The very forces that should have destroyed mountain beauty traditions ended up proving just how valuable they really were. World War I turned alpine valleys into battlegrounds, and suddenly everyone discovered that mountain women possessed skills that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Their knowledge of mountain paths, their ability to survive in conditions that would kill lowland soldiers, their traditional techniques for moving unseen through hostile terrain, all of this became crucial military intelligence. But here's what gets me about this period. Mountain women didn't just provide support services. They became active combatants whose traditional beauty practices turned into weapons of war. In the Pyrenean Mountains, women used their traditional clothing to smuggle refugees and resistance fighters across borders. Those elaborate traditional dresses with their complex folds and hidden pockets, perfect for concealing documents, money, and small weapons. Those intricate traditional hairstyles, ideal for hiding messages and coded information. They developed what they called resistance beauty, aesthetic practices specifically designed for espionage and guerrilla warfare, hairstyles that could hide messages, jewelry with secret compartments for documents, cosmetics that could alter appearance when necessary. Traditional mountain beauty became the perfect cover for activities that could get you shot. And the thing is, it worked. German occupation forces never suspected that the simple mountain women in traditional dress were actually highly trained resistance operatives. The beauty traditions that lowland critics had dismissed as primitive turned out to be sophisticated camouflage systems that modern military intelligence couldn't penetrate. But the most remarkable story from this period involves Princess Anna Dolgorukova, a Russian aristocrat fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, who found herself in a Swiss alpine village in 1918. Picture this scene. Here's a woman who had lived her entire life, surrounded by the most sophisticated luxury that European civilization could provide. Her idea of roughing it was spending a weekend at a country estate. She wore clothing that cost more than most people made in a year. Her beauty routine required servants and equipment that filled entire rooms. And suddenly she's in a mountain village where the local women are offering to teach her how to survive without any of the things she'd considered essential to civilized life. What happened next created one of the most fascinating cultural exchanges in history. The local mountain women taught Princess Anna their practical beauty techniques, how to make cosmetics from available materials, how to style hair without elaborate tools, how to create elegant appearance using only what you could carry. But Princess Anna wasn't just a passive recipient of this knowledge. She shared her sophisticated grooming techniques, her understanding of European fashion, and her knowledge of courtly beauty standards. The result was a fusion of aristocratic and alpine aesthetics that created something entirely new. This fusion proved to be remarkably influential. Other Russian refugees in mountain communities began adopting similar hybrid practices. The European nobility who encountered these communities started incorporating mountain techniques into their own beauty routines. What began as a desperate survival measure became a sophisticated new aesthetic that influenced beauty culture across Europe. Meanwhile, in Tibet, something even more dramatic was happening. The Chinese invasion of 1950 forced mountain women to choose between cultural preservation and physical survival. When the Dalai Lama fled to India with thousands of refugees, Tibetan mountain women became the guardians of their beauty traditions. They couldn't carry much across the Himalayas, but they could carry knowledge. The traditional techniques for creating cosmetics from mountain plants, the methods for weaving traditional patterns, the skills for crafting traditional jewelry, all of this traveled in the memories of refugee women. In exile communities in India and Nepal, these women became living libraries. They taught their daughters techniques that could only be practiced in secret. They preserved traditional knowledge by embedding it in beauty practices that could be maintained even in refugee camps. But here's what's remarkable about this. They didn't just preserve tradition, they adapted it. Traditional Tibetan beauty practices evolved to incorporate materials available in their new homes. Traditional patterns were modified to work with new tools and techniques. The beauty culture that emerged from exile was simultaneously authentically Tibetan and uniquely adapted to new circumstances. This created a diaspora beauty culture that was more resilient and more innovative than the original had ever been. Tibetan women in exile became cultural ambassadors whose beauty practices introduced the world to aesthetic traditions that had been hidden in the Himalayas for centuries. The advent of television in the 1950s brought another seismic shift. For the first time, mountain women could see how their appearance compared to international beauty standards. They could watch Hollywood movies and European fashion shows and see exactly how different their traditional aesthetics were from global trends. Some mountain communities banned televisions to preserve traditional culture. Others embraced the technology as a window to the wider world. But the most interesting response came from communities that used television to study and analyze global beauty trends. These mountain women became sophisticated critics of international fashion. They understood that Hollywood beauty standards were designed for specific lighting and camera conditions, not for real-world functionality. They could see that European fashion was optimized for temperate climates and urban environments, not for mountain conditions. This analytical approach allowed them to selectively adopt global innovations while maintaining the functional core of their traditional practices. They learned new techniques from television and magazines, but they adapted those techniques to serve mountain-specific needs. Then came the hippie movement of the 1960s, and suddenly everything flipped upside down. Urban people started traveling to mountain communities, seeking natural beauty techniques that mountain women had preserved for centuries. What had been dismissed as primitive was suddenly celebrated as organic and holistic. Young lowland women came to alpine villages, Appalachian hollers, and Andean communities asking to learn traditional beauty practices. They wanted to know how to make cosmetics from plants, how to create hairstyles that didn't require electricity, how to achieve beauty without relying on industrial products. This created a fascinating reversal. Mountain women found themselves teaching traditional techniques to urban visitors who paid substantial fees for knowledge that mountain communities had been preserving for free. Traditional beauty practices became valuable cultural exports. But here's what made this different from earlier cultural exchanges. This time, mountain women maintained control. They decided which techniques to share and which to keep private. They charged fair prices for their knowledge. They insisted that traditional practices be learned properly, not simplified for mass consumption. Some mountain communities established formal schools where traditional beauty techniques were taught alongside their cultural and spiritual context. Students learned not just how to create traditional hairstyles, but why those hairstyles had developed, what purposes they served, and how they fit into broader cultural systems. This educational approach ensured that traditional knowledge was preserved accurately rather than being distorted by outside interpretation. Mountain women became teachers and cultural ambassadors rather than just sources of exotic techniques for appropriation. The environmental movement of the 1970s brought another wave of interest in mountain beauty traditions. As people became aware of the ecological costs of industrial beauty products, traditional mountain practices offered sustainable alternatives. Mountain women had always created beauty using locally available renewable materials. Their techniques emphasized durability and functionality rather than disposable fashion. Their aesthetic traditions were inherently sustainable because they had developed in environments where waste meant death. This alignment with environmental values gave mountain beauty traditions new relevance and respect. Traditional practices that had been dismissed as backward were suddenly recognized as environmentally advanced. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of mountain women as political and cultural leaders. Women who had preserved traditional beauty knowledge became advocates for indigenous rights, environmental protection, and cultural preservation. They used their platform as guardians of traditional culture to address broader political issues affecting mountain communities. Their beauty practices became symbols of resistance to cultural homogenization and environmental destruction. This politicization of mountain beauty created a new kind of cultural power. When mountain women appeared in traditional dress at international conferences, they weren't just representing their own communities, they were representing alternative ways of living that offered solutions to global problems. As the 20th century ended, mountain beauty traditions had not just survived the modern world, they had proven their value to it. Traditional practices that had developed in isolation were now recognized as sophisticated solutions to contemporary challenges. The stage was set for something unprecedented, the global recognition of mountain beauty traditions as essential knowledge for humanity's future. So here we are, 21st century, digital age, global connectivity. And if you thought this would be the moment when ancient mountain beauty traditions finally got swept away by modernization, well, you couldn't be more wrong. What's happening instead is something that would have blown the minds of those Venetian merchants who first brought lowland beauty standards to alpine villages 500 years ago. Mountain women today are live streaming traditional beauty tutorials to audiences of millions, while their grandmothers teach them techniques that predate written history. Think about that for a second. The same hands that braid hair in patterns older than Egyptian hieroglyphs are typing Instagram captions that reach followers from Tokyo to Sao Paulo. Ancient mountain beauty knowledge is going viral in the most literal sense possible. But here's what makes this moment so fascinating. It's not cultural appropriation or dilution of tradition. It's mountain women taking control of their own narrative for the first time in history. Let me give you a concrete example. In a remote Himalayan village, a young woman named Pema makes videos showing how her grandmother creates traditional Tibetan cosmetics from high-altitude plants. But she's not just demonstrating techniques. She's explaining the chemistry behind why these formulations work better than commercial alternatives at extreme altitudes. Her grandmother points out which minerals create colors that don't fade in intense UV radiation. Pema translates this into scientific terminology for her international audience. The result is content that's simultaneously ancient wisdom and cutting-edge chemistry education. And the response? Beauty companies are sending researchers to these villages, trying to understand traditional formulations that outperform their synthetic alternatives. What mountain women had figured out through centuries of trial and error, modern science is now confirming as biochemically superior. This brings us to something that's revolutionizing how we think about beauty and environment: the climate change crisis. Traditional mountain beauty practices emphasized sustainability and harmony with natural cycles because mountain environments couldn't support waste or excess. Now, as the rest of the world grapples with environmental collapse, these practices are being recognized as blueprints for sustainable living. Urban beauty companies are studying traditional mountain techniques for creating cosmetics from renewable local materials. Fashion designers are learning from mountain textile traditions that emphasize durability over disposability. Wellness practitioners are adapting mountain beauty rituals that integrated physical care with mental and spiritual health. But the real revolution happened during the COVID pandemic of 2020. When the world went into lockdown, urban people suddenly found themselves in situations that mountain communities had always navigated: isolation, resource scarcity, and the need for self-sufficiency. And guess what they turned to for guidance? Traditional mountain beauty practices. Urban influencers started making videos about creating cosmetics from kitchen ingredients, techniques that mountain women had been using for millennia. People learned to style hair without professional tools, to find beauty in simplicity, to create skincare routines that worked with natural materials rather than against them. Mountain communities, already accustomed to self-sufficiency and home-based beauty practices, became unexpected guides for global populations, trying to maintain their appearance and well-being during unprecedented isolation. This created a remarkable inversion of traditional power dynamics. Instead of mountain beauty being seen as primitive compared to urban sophistication, traditional mountain practices were suddenly recognized as advanced solutions to modern problems. But let's look at what's happening in specific mountain communities to see how this plays out in practice. In the Scottish Highlands, young women are wearing traditional tartans to music festivals, where their clan patterns get photographed by fashion bloggers and shared across social media. But these aren't costumes or cultural appropriation. These are Highland women reclaiming their aesthetic heritage and using it to connect with global communities. Fashion designers are studying tartan patterns and trying to adapt them for mass production. But Highland women aren't just passive sources of inspiration. When on D, they're licensing their traditional designs, controlling how their cultural heritage gets used commercially, and ensuring that profits flow back to Highland communities. This has created a new economic model where traditional beauty culture becomes valuable intellectual property that mountain communities can monetize while maintaining cultural control. In Tibet, refugees have established beauty schools in India and Nepal, where they teach traditional techniques to preserve their culture while earning income from international students. Tibetan mountain beauty traditions that were once practiced only on the roof of the world now influence wellness practices from California to Scandinavia. But here's what's remarkable about these schools. They're not just teaching techniques. They're teaching philosophy. Students learn about the Buddhist principles that inform traditional Tibetan beauty practices. They understand how mountain environments shaped aesthetic choices. They study the spiritual dimensions of appearance and self-care. This holistic approach ensures that traditional knowledge gets transmitted with its full cultural context, rather than being reduced to superficial techniques. In the Andes, indigenous mountain women have formed cooperatives that sell traditional textiles and beauty products through online platforms. Their ancient techniques reach global markets while providing economic independence for their communities. These women live-stream weaving demonstrations from peaks that touch the clouds. They show international audiences how traditional patterns encode mathematical knowledge, how natural dyes create colors that synthetic alternatives can't match, how traditional tools produce textiles that are more durable and more beautiful than machine-made alternatives. But the most significant development is how mountain beauty traditions are influencing our understanding of what beauty means in the modern world. For thousands of years, mountain women have practiced beauty that emphasized function over form, sustainability over luxury, community connection over individual vanity. These values are becoming increasingly relevant as global society grapples with environmental crisis, social isolation, and the psychological costs of consumer culture. Mountain beauty offers an alternative model, AG, one that connects personal appearance to environmental health, community well-being, and spiritual development. It suggests that true beauty comes from harmony with your environment, competence in essential skills, and authentic expression of cultural identity. This is why mountain beauty traditions are experiencing such a renaissance. They offer something that mass-produced beauty culture can't provide: meaning, sustainability, and genuine connection to place and community. Looking forward, the future of mountain beauty standards lies not in choosing between tradition and modernity, but in the synthesis that mountain women have always practiced. They've always adapted ancient wisdom to current circumstances while maintaining essential connections between beauty, environment, and community. Today's mountain women are using digital technology to preserve and share traditional knowledge. They're applying scientific understanding to validate traditional practices. They're creating economic opportunities that support their communities without compromising their cultural values. And they're demonstrating something that the rest of the world desperately needs to learn: that beauty and sustainability aren't contradictory, that tradition and innovation can strengthen each other, and that the most sophisticated solutions often come from the deepest wisdom. The mountain women who painted their faces with sacred ochre 7,000 years ago would recognize their descendants today, not because nothing has changed, but because everything essential has been preserved. The connection between beauty and survival, between appearance and competence, between individual expression and community identity, MNA, these relationships remain as strong as the mountains themselves. And as the rest of the world struggles with questions about authentic beauty, sustainable living, and meaningful connection to place and community, mountain women continue to offer answers that have been tested against the most challenging conditions on Earth. The future of beauty lies not in the valleys where civilizations rise and fall, but in the eternal mountains where human creativity meets environmental necessity, where ancient wisdom adapts to eternal change, and where beauty remains what it has always been in the high places: survival made sacred. The mountains endure, and so does the beauty born in stone and sky.